Welcome to Inner Rhythm, a podcast about the creative process and following your inner voice. As always, we are broadcasting today from the historic home of artists Jackson Pollock and Pollock-Krasner, where we aim to connect you with their legacy of artistic authenticity. I'm your host and the director of the PK House, Matthew Ward. On today's episode, we uncover the inner rhythm of curator Matthew Yokobosky. Now the senior curator of fashion and material culture at the Brooklyn Museum, Yokobosky has curated and designed over 100 temporary and permanent exhibitions, including Georgia O'Keeffe, Living Modern, Studio 54, Night Magic, and Christian Dior, Designer of Dreams. Our conversation, which was filmed in front of a live audience at the historic home of Pollock-Krasner, covers Yokobosky's career path, from his early internships to his tenure as a curator of film at the Whitney Museum, all the way to his time as an exhibition designer at the Brooklyn Museum, and to his current role as the driving force behind some of today's most innovative and popular exhibitions. We discuss Matthew's creative process, how he carved out his own path in the arts, how he distinguishes between curation and exhibition design, and how marketing factors into producing a successful exhibition. I would like to thank all of our supporters who allow the Pollock-Krasner House to fulfill its mission. I also thank all of you for being here with us today, whether listening on your favorite podcast platform or watching on YouTube. If you would like more information about Inner Rhythm or about today's guest, please visit the show notes below. Thank you. Matthew Yokobosky from the Brooklyn Museum. Matthew is, yes. Matthew is the senior curator of fashion and material culture over at the Brooklyn Museum. He has designed over 100 temporary and permanent exhibitions, including Georgia O'Keeffe, Living Modern, Studio 54, Night Magic, most recently the Mugler show, although by now that might not be most recently.
No, it was, and I have a new show opening in November.
Okay, which we will talk about.
We can talk about that.
Okay, great. And tonight we are going to have a conversation about exhibition design, exhibition curation. Matthew has worked both as an exhibition designer, as a curator at various points back and forth throughout your career.
Yeah.
And I think at the moment, it's fair to say that you are most recognized for your fashion exhibitions currently. But that is not the area where you started it. No. You started, to the best of my knowledge, you set out to be a curator of film.
Correct.
So could you walk us through where you started in your career? Was fashion in your mind at the beginning and you finally arrived at it? Or has the trajectory changed over time?
Yes.
Okay.
I think the thing is that when we go to school, we are interested in a particular topic, and we think about careers because we know about those careers. Yeah. But as you go through life, you realize that there's a lot more variety and a lot more opportunities that you weren't even aware of. So when I was at the University of Pittsburgh, I was studying film and video, and but I had always had an interest in fashion. And in fact, before I went to school, I had for a while been lobbying my mom to move to New York so I could go to Parsons and study fashion design. But I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, and the idea of moving to New York was just out of the question. So the closest big city was Pittsburgh. And the first year and a half, I was studying pre-med. Because I was always good in art and science and math, and I had options, but of course your parents always want you to be practical. So I started that, and then after a year, I remember I called my mom and I said, I think I'm going to take film and art next season, and it was like dead phone, and so they didn't have a specific film studies program at that time, and although there was a film aspect to the English department. And so you had to do a self-design major. So I'd been working on a self-design major, which was film studies and design. And the design aspect of it was mostly in the theater arts department. So it was set design, costume design, makeup, those sorts of things. And by the time I had gotten that whole proposal written up, the university had designated film studies as an official degree, and that's what my diploma says. But I had a lot of design classes, yeah. So I did an internship at the Carnegie Museum in the film and video department. And when I graduated, they offered me a position as curatorial assistant. So I did for a long time think that I was going to be just a film, not just, but I was, my curation area was going to be film and video. And I did that for 2 years at the Carnegie, and then I got a call from the Whitney. They said, we have an opening in the film and video department. We've heard so much about you. Would you come up for an interview? So I did, and I got the job. And it was when the Whitney was still on 75th and Madison in the old Breuer building. So so it was amazing. So I get this job. My first office was on the 5th floor of the Breuer, and across the hall from the director's office, which was Tom Armstrong at the time. And so if you go to the Breuer 5th floor now, it's all enclosed. But when I first started, there were patios around the whole edge. And during the summer, Tom used to grow tomatoes out on the outside.
That's so sweet.
And then by August, September, he used to have like a vegetable stand out in front of him. So that was, and my whole office was like Marcel Breuer furniture. And I mean, it was just incredible.
Now, you said something that I'm great things about you. Thinking back, what can you point to that you were doing at Carnegie that caught their attention, do you think? When you're in that early career phase?
Yeah, very, very early career phase. So this was pre-internet, you know, I'm talking mid-1980s. And so we had computers, but it wasn't, you know, it was very basic. And so part of my job at the Carnegie was that they had something, it was called the Film and Video Makers Travel Sheet. And this was a newsletter that went out once a month that alerted people and institutions. We had this huge mailing list of over 1,000 people that were interested in independent film. And we did this newsletter every month that my job was to compile it and be in touch with all the filmmakers to find out where they were going to be so I could put the listing in it. And it was that kind of job where you had an opportunity to really reach out in the field, and people knew you. So if they had a film gig, they started calling. So in a short time, I knew like the whole film and video field.
Did you know that when you were, now is this the newsletter, did you seek it out? Were you assigned it?
It was kind of part of the job, yeah.
And did that excite you at first? Did you realize how valuable that would be?
Well, what happened was that when I did my internship at the Carnegie, the curator of film and video was this guy named Bill Judson, and his area of specialization was avant-garde cinema and early French film like Abel Gance. If you ever saw his film Napoleon, which is extraordinary, from 1917, the finale of Napoleon is this 3-screen projection. I mean, it's like before we were doing multi-screen immersion. Abel Gance was already, you know, because film wasn't CinemaScope yet in 1917. It was like, you know, 4:3. So you watch the whole movie 4:3, and suddenly the last reel, it's 3. I mean, could you imagine how exciting that was? And they had recreated it at one point in the 1980s at Radio City Music Hall and with a live orchestra. So, I mean, how fabulous. So anyway, part of my internship, Bill thought I had to have a project if I was going to do an internship, or he wasn't going to let me intern with him. And he decided that I should do a booklet of all the places where they showed independent and avant-garde film. So I made this card, I sent it out to I got some sent the information. I have to, not everybody always replies to your card. So you reach out a lot. And so I did this booklet. It was called the Media Exhibitors Directory for Independent Artists. And after having done that, then of course that added to their offering me the position. And I knew they did the Film and Video Makers travel sheet. I just didn't realize that I was going to be doing it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And just thinking about some of your recent work, like the Pierre Cardin exhibition, for example, I think of the Beauty and the Beast element, and I kind of see the film and video coming back in. Do you find opportunities still to have the film curator come out?
I do. I'm kind of drawn to it like a magnet, because, as soon as I'm working on a fashion designer, I'm already trying to find out did they do costumes for any films or that sort of thing. And so it was really great to find out that Pierre Cardin had done costumes for film.
Yeah.
Beauty and the Beast, and later he had a long relationship with the French actress Jean Moreau. And so from like 1962 to 1967, 68, he did all of the clothes that she wears in film. So he had actually quite a great relationship with cinema. Yeah.
So these themes, they overlap, they intersect, but on the way to you doing all the great work you've been doing recently with fashion designers, there's a step, huge chapter. Not a step, a huge chapter between you being a curator of film and you being now the senior curator of fashion material culture, and that is your career as an exhibition designer.
Yes.
So how does that happen?
Right. So I moved to New York, and so we have those prints up again, by the way. The Hiroshige prints, they're only on view every 20 years. So if you can come to Brooklyn and see them, don't miss them. They're the best set of those prints in existence, okay? Anyway, a little plug.
Yeah, no.
So I moved to New York. I'm working at the Whitney in the film and video department, and I start hanging out at this theater called La Mama, which is on the Lower East Side. La Mama was this avant-garde theater that started in the early 60s. There was this woman named, so many things I did. There was this woman named Ellen Stewart. And Ellen Stewart had been a seamstress during the 1950s. She worked at Saks Fifth Avenue a lot. But she got involved in avant-garde theater, and she started this space where people could do experimental theater, like André Serban did Trojan Women at La Mama. So I was hanging out there, and I was asked to start doing sets and costumes. Because people knew I was fashion-y.
Yeah.
So I started to do costumes, and then from that, young, you kind of go like, well, you could do a set like this, or you could do a set like that. Or, well, why don't you design the set? So I suddenly had these opportunities at La Mama, which was experimental. And if you've ever been there, at the beginning of every performance, Ellen would come out and she'd go, "Welcome to La Mama." And of course, she'd want you to come back again and all that sort of thing. But she always started every performance with the bell. She rang. Yeah. So I was doing sets and costumes at La Mama, for 2 years, and one of them won a Bessie Award for set and costume design. And the next day I came into the Whitney, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, we heard you just won. Did you ever consider doing exhibition design?" And, up until the mid 80s, late 80s, early 90s, exhibition design was really the curator coming in and say, we need a wall because we're going to have a painting here. Let's be avant-garde and have one blue accent wall, or something. It was really basic. And and it hadn't really gotten to this place where people were doing like exhibition design, like where it was like a environment, or not that artists weren't doing video installations or in immersive spaces. I think of Alan Capro in the 50s. You see those pictures, but mostly it was people were making nice white boxes. That was what was like good, considered good. And so when I started doing exhibition design, I was like, well, why does it have to be a square room? Why can't the wall be angled? Why do all the walls have to be the same height? Why does the wall have to be continuous? Why couldn't there be a crack in the wall? Why, I just started asking questions like, why can't it be more than, there is, I want to preface and say, it's not that there's not the appropriate moment where you want to have the beautiful white wall with the painting. There are moments for that. I'm working on a new show now where I'm going to have that in one of the spaces.
Okay.
But I think it's very specific today. And I think you have to be a little bit thoughtful and careful with it, because it can also get very clinical very quickly. And the thing I always think about, which is why I love being here at the Pollock-Krasner house, is that, typically you're not making art in a white box. And yet that's where it ends up, in a white box. And you think about back before the invention of electricity, or before white room studios were popular, people were painting in environments that had a lot going on and a lot of stimulus. And so I kind of felt like sometimes the art felt better when there was a little more atmosphere, So for example, when I was working with a curator named Thierry Carbone. She was a curator of American art at Brooklyn. And one of the first projects we worked on was she had this idea to do a show called American Identities, which was looking at artists who were looking at America from many perspectives. And we were laying out the show, and I just decided that every room part there was going to be a color. I just decided, like, if you're showing paintings from the 17th and 18th century, they weren't going to have zinc white walls. They were going to have a blue wall, or they're going to have a green wall, or they're going to have more environment. And so we approached it that way. And at the end of some rooms I had more than one color. I kind of got in trouble for that. But and it ended up, the exhibition ended up having, I think, 42 colors in total. And some people, it rocked their world. They weren't happy. Other people loved it. We kind of had like a great divide. But people talked about it. People wanted to come and see it because they'd heard about it. And that is a little bit now about what you can do with exhibition design, create buzz. So when I started out, we didn't have iPhones, we didn't have smartphones, we just, you were trying to get people to talk about things. And one of the first big experiences I had with that was in 1993. I was working on the Whitney Biennial with Elizabeth Sussman. And Elizabeth had started to notice that a lot of artists were making very political work. Eventually that became known as the Politically Correct Biennial. And almost every artist that was picked for the show had an agenda, had some message they wanted to convey. And, up to like the ticket stubs, even the tickets, the metal clip you got for your ticket, if you got all 6 of them, there were 6 different ones, it said, "I can't imagine ever wanting to be white." I mean, it started right from the door. And that show generated so much buzz because it was very edgy, work that was just right of that moment. And, of course, today I see people are like, "Oh, we're doing Politica." I'm like, we did that 30 years ago. And even when we did that in 1993, I felt so much about the relationship back to the 60s, art exhibitions, that sort of thing. And of course, should we let them in? Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Come in.
Hey.
No, welcome.
No, come on in.
We're so happy you're here. We're just kind of, have a seat. Okay. Yeah. Sit wherever you like.
There's a couple back there.
Okay. Okay, cool.
He's a
Yeah. 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 But having had that experience was a shock to my system. Like we had like Barbara Walters come because she had to have a private tour to know what all the buzz was going on at the Whitney.
Now, when you're dealing with work that has so much to say, how do you come in as the exhibition designer when the work is so loud?
So that's a nuance you have to work through because there's a especially when you're working on something like a biennial, you have 60 artists, living artists. It's not artists or the people are gone, but they all will start to tell, especially at that point, they start to tell you like, I need, a wall that's this long and it needs to be green and I want this shade of green and the lighting needs to be like this. And, and you have people like Matthew Barney coming in and saying, "No, I can't use museum lights." And the next day he walks in with fluorescent lights and he's installing them himself in the ceilings.
Did he ask me?
No.
Oh, okay.
It was a problem.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, he was great and lovely. But
As long as you say he was great.
he is. He's a great artist. He's a great artist. But people, you had to watch because people were doing things that wasn't their job, and so you have art handlers who are in unions, you have buildings people who say like, you can't drill into the surface, and you turn your back and somebody's drilling into that surface. I mean, there was a famous story at the Whitney. It was like it was one of the biennials in the 80s where they had Kenny Scharf. And Kenny Scharf was painting a hallway or something, and he wanted to keep painting at night. So they left a guard and they left him painting. Well, he painted like all the brass work on the telephone booths. And I mean, it was all beautiful, but then of course it had to be restored after the show, so there's a lot of crazy stories like that. So if it's a living artist, you're working with them to kind of go along with their aesthetic to make it, but in a group show you have to be thoughtful about who's next to who.
Yeah. That's
a very big consideration. So when I worked on like the 95 Whitney Biennial with, there was a curator named Klaus Kurtes he had one of the most impeccable eyes I've ever worked with and learned so much. And with Klaus, I actually built a model of the Whitney, and we would make miniatures of we were very old school, and pin the artwork onto the foam core model and everything. But it was a big dance. I remember he was very concerned about whether we could hang an Ellen Gallagher painting next to a Agnes Martin painting. Even though when you look at them together, you can see that there is an interesting relationship. And I remember Elizabeth Sussman had a big concern about whether we could have a Charles Ray's, I forget what it's called, but it's the mutant family, where all the children and adults are all the same height, next to a painting by Peter Kane, which was like mutant cars, you know? And so there's a lot of thought about like, will people read that together, that there's a relationship that you don't want or do want?
Yeah.
You have to start thinking about that a lot. So, of course, when you're working with art where the artists aren't living, you can be more cavalier about how you want it, but you're always working with a curator. And you know that conversation, you do kind of test the limits to see what direction a curator can go in. Some are very strict, you know. For example, I remember I was doing an installation of the Whitney's permanent collection with Barbara Haskell, who Barbara and I have worked together since I started the Whitney. But we had a long conversation once because we were doing a permanent collection show and I wanted to paint the walls pale green, which I thought was going to be just perfect with the artwork that we were showing. We just couldn't get there. So we ended up with a pale sand color. Okay.
And you couldn't get there because, did you test the color on the wall and did you feel it worked?
I loved it.
Okay.
I used the color later on for another project.
So that brings up another point, and very interesting in your case because you have embodied both of these roles at points simultaneously. At the Whitney, you were both a curator and a part-time exhibition designer at the same time.
Correct.
And then you would go on to work at the Brooklyn Museum as exclusively an exhibition designer until your most recent role of, again, being a senior curator. So how did you navigate relationships with the curator on a show when you are the designer? I'm guessing that changes on a person-to-person basis, how the relationship works.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happened in the 90s, you know, so you're idealistic, you're starting out your career, you want to be a film and video curator, and then the 90s come around and a lot of biennials were happening and a lot of curators who, you know, previously if you were a painting curator, that might be your area. You just did painting. And I thought I was just going to do film and video, sometimes sound art, you know, maybe go be edgy. For the most part, curators were curators of specific things.
Yes.
Yeah. And in the 90s, the curators got more pan-focused, you know, and so suddenly you had, and it happened, I think, mostly beginning with contemporary art. Contemporary curators, you know, they were seeing artists working in video and film and photography and performance. And so the curators were then feeling like they could curate all media because the artists were working in all media. And by the end of the 90s, I was asking myself, like, well, should I also be curating painting and photography? You know, should I not be specialized? And it was also that time when there was a big shift from, and I'm going to say this, connoisseurship. There were, you know, the curator I talked about earlier, Klaus Kurtes, and also when I came to Brooklyn, there was a curator named Barry Harwood, who was a curator of decorative arts. These curators had such exquisite taste, and they would look at two vases, which you might, you know, it's that, you know, that crazy scene in The Devil Wears Prada where she goes, the two belts, they look so alike. You know, I don't know, I can't choose. Well, the same, you know, it's kind of like that with art. You know, a lot of times you have two paintings, you have to pick one. How do you pick it? Well, there are curators who they just because of their experience of looking, because of conversations that they've had, they have such refined ways of looking and can make such beautiful decisions about which piece to choose and then what to show it with. And as the learning and the education changed in the 90s, I really, it became less about the singular precious piece.
Yeah.
And it became more about like, what is the art saying?
The narrative.
And language. The narrative and you also felt like more that you had to, the wall labels became very important because it wasn't always clear just from looking why these two artworks were together. And so I was starting to reconsider like what I was doing by the late 90s. And I had been having this amazing other career happening, first as set and costume design and then exhibition design. So when it came up of like, would you be interested in just focusing on exhibition design? I think because of the way the field was going, I didn't feel like being a film and video curator was so unique as it had once been and so specific because it was being absorbed in contemporary art, that I was open to making a switch. I mean, I don't think I ever quite told that story before, but yeah. But that was how I was feeling at the time.
It sounds like in the 80s and 90s, based on how you were describing the situation, the curator and the exhibition designer were more closely aligned in terms of aesthetic sensibilities and a kind of sensitivity to the aesthetic qualities. As the curator, in a broad sense, became more interested, like you said, in the text and the overarching story and less in the feeling of the visual experience being intuitive or feeling right rather than saying why it's right. Did you feel that and then as you made the shift to being an exhibition designer, was that then a position with more responsibility than you had found it previously in your career?
Well, having it, I don't know many other people who've been curators and then became exhibition designers, but I had all that history coming into being an exhibition designer, and I had the conversations that I would have with curators would be very different, and they would tell me like, "Oh, I didn't think, I hadn't talked to an exhibition designer about that before," or, up to that point, like sometimes you'd bring in an architect to design your exhibition. That would happen frequently. I remember seeing a beautiful exhibition at MoMA that Tadeo Ando designed, where each of the rooms was circular. It was spectacular. Stephen Hall designed a show for us where the walls were made of scratch coat, which is the underlayer if you're making plaster walls, scratch coat. And he curved all the top corners of the walls like book pages. It was very beautiful. So that was not uncommon. Occasionally we'd have an architect come in and design it. But the conversation, sometimes I would feel almost like an exhibition doctor, because the curator would come in and they'd have a checklist of works that they wanted to have. And a lot of times when you get a checklist from a curator, it's printed out in a sheet, where all the pictures are the same, and they keep looking at that, and they, I think, believe that they're all equal, And then you sit down to make the model with them, and you go like, well, actually, the sculpture is this big and your photograph's this big. I don't know that that works so well if you're having one label for both.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you start having reality moments, or like you have this big video installation which has like bass drums playing in it next to this quiet white painting. Do you really want this? I mean, you have to ask questions, you know. So my conversations with curators were new for a lot of curators. Yeah.
And yet, when you're making this transition, do you feel like you are a different professional? Have you changed? Or are you the same curator you always were, but being utilized for a specific type of curation you were doing?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think sometimes people think that, you know, I'm very much a person that really believes every person who's working in an organization, everybody's important, you know? And I think when I first went into it, I felt like some curators really felt like I took a step down because I was going to be an exhibition designer. Like that wasn't, you know, it wasn't curator.
Yeah.
But when I went into the job, I really felt like that was a great job.
Yeah.
You know, and I really felt like it was creative, and it was really going to help me curators tell their story the way they wanted to tell it. And, you know, it was a bit like avant-garde theater, you know, where you're trying to knit the pieces together. You know, avant-garde theater is that, you know, it'll be like you're working with a director and they're like, well, here I'm going to have a scene set in 1800 and then we're going to switch to the 20th century. And, you know, I mean, it just becomes this complex. Oh, if you have a chance to go to see Twyla Tharp's new piece at the little island in Manhattan, please go. It's a really great work of avant-garde dance and music, but it's Twyla Tharp. It's called How Long Something. Yeah. How Long Blues. Thank you. How Long Blues. Twyla Tharp, and the music is by T-Bone Burnett. It's really super. But it has that feeling of avant-garde theater where all these different periods and visuals are like a collision. And you don't know how they fit together, but at the end of it, you just go, wow, what did I just see? You know, it's pretty extraordinary. So having come to that and then working with curators, I really felt like that I could work with a curator and help them realize what they wanted to say and actually help clarify for them, which is clarifying for the public, what they want to say. Like, do you want to have a work here? Do you need an extra work here that might help fix that? Or maybe you have too many of this. You know, I was able to have those kind of frank conversations with the curator because they also knew I had been a curator.
Yes.
So that helped a lot.
And do you feel that the perception of exhibition designer during your long tenure in that role at the Brooklyn Museum changed?
Well, I do, because, I mean, it was hard too, because sometimes the design would come out so good, and sometimes they would talk about the design and not mention the curator. I mean, that happened to me too. That was awkward, you know. So because, you know, it looked good. So yeah. So I feel like I did help elevate the field of exhibition design. Absolutely. I think that then it helped me, like if I was looking for a position for the department, I would get like 400 or 500 applications. You know, people wanted to work in the department.
Yeah.
And so we had a really great department and I was overseeing exhibition design and graphic design at the time.
Oh, and graphic design.
Yes.
would that encompass just what visitors would see in gallery, or does the entire brand identity of the museum?
It was, for a time, it was the whole identity.
Wow.
Yeah. So I worked with 2x4, which is a graphic design company, to do the rebranding in 2004.
Okay.
And we were the ones who did, people either loved it or didn't like it, but we had these bees that had like a splash to it. And there was a set of 8 bees. They were our logos.
Okay.
And the idea at the beginning was that the bee, this bee shape in the middle of it was constant, but the shape changed. So like the museum was constantly changing, but at the heart, we were always the same. I mean, this was the, you know, whenever you're working on a logo, there's always that kind of, we're trying to verbalize what it is we're talking about. But that ended up lasting for over 15 years.
So your relationship with the look of the Brooklyn Museum was pretty holistic, not just the exhibition experience, but the way that your public was seeing you on the page, on the screen, in advertisements.
Yeah.
Did the two feed into each other? When you're designing an exhibition, are you also thinking of yourself as the brand manager for the museum?
Oh, yeah, I'm.
Are exhibitions on brand?
You know, more, you know, I mean, you know, so I didn't, when I would go into a project, I never really thought like I'm the author of this project and we're going to do this. You know, it wasn't, I didn't feel like I was having a Cecil B. DeMille moment, you know. But you do feel a responsibility to help keep the museum in the public eye. You want to make an exhibition that people, you know, word of mouth is invaluable. So if you have people talking about your show, I mean, hopefully it's good, talking good, you know, sometimes they, you know, it can be, I mean, we just did Picasso, which just, you know, that got a lot of chatter, But people came to see it because they wanted to know why. You know, it was like Barbara Walters coming to the 93 biennial. You know, people hear, and if it gets to that level, I mean, it's extraordinary. So, you know, I was working, so the director at the time was Arnold Lehman. And Arnold Lehman, I think, had a showman streak in him and was very much interested in having more people come to the museum. I mean, he was the one that started First Saturdays. I mean, people don't realize, like, there was no First Saturday before Arnold had his First Saturday First, sponsored by Target. And it allowed the museum to stay open all into the Saturday evening, and the public could come in for free. Well, a lot of people in Brooklyn, you know, they knew the museum was there. They weren't coming to see us, you know, and it was a question about how are we going to make exhibitions and programs and different things at the museum just so that our community felt like they could come and have a great time at the museum. So things like First Saturday really helped, you know, I mean, the first couple First Saturdays, there were just, you know, a couple hundred people would come because it was free or because it was air conditioned, you know, it would be hot in the summer. But, you know, then we started having like music on the plaza and music in the lobby and you could hear it and different lectures and things, you know, it just grew. I mean, if you come to our First Saturday now, it's quite the event, but more and more people, our attendance started to go up. And when we did, like, when I did the Annie Leibovitz show, you know, it was like, you know, oh, you're going to do Annie Leibovitz. You know, if you were choosing any photographer, you know, she does Vanity Fair. You know, I mean, people will tell you things like as if she wasn't a great photographer, you know. So we did Annie Leibovitz and 300,000 people came to see Annie Leibovitz. And because they'd heard of her, because she had gone on Oprah and The View when she was talking about the show. She had done a book. But it was that mix of popularity and great photography that really spoke to people. And in the show, we also had a section which was about, it was Annie's like working board. So we had these homosote panels. So she has a place upstate, and when she was working on a book about her work, she had installed these 4 by 8 foot homosote panels where she had thumbtacked these images to it. Like it was like this working board. Well, I saw it and I said, Annie, we're going to reproduce this in the gallery. And she's like, no. And I'm like, yeah. And I said, no, we're going to do it. We're going to do it. And we did. And people love seeing kind of behind the scenes kind of things. I mean, it was really a great part of the show. People didn't want to leave that area. So nothing is, so I know this is a long story, but so we're doing Annie Leibovitz, and so there was that concern, like, will people think it's serious enough that we're doing, even though you have great didactic panels that are talking about her history, why she's doing this kind of photography, how it came to be. She started at Rolling Stone magazine. I mean, this whole long trajectory for Annie. And so simultaneously then, we had an exhibition up of Ron Muick's sculpture, who is quite an extraordinary sculptor, Ron Muick. So we had the Ron Muick show up as kind of a, to answer that question, it's like, are they a serious museum? They're doing commercial photography, so people would have the option to also see the Ron Muick. So a lot of people saw Ron Muick that wouldn't have seen him normally. So it kind of had a great for both of them, and they both got really high attendance.
Well, when you're in a large space like the Brooklyn Museum.
I'm telling you so much out of...
No, that's what we want.
Okay.
But
I'm sharing.
Yes. This is an intimate space.
Yes.
We're friends. And I haven't been using the slideshow, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I was curious what was up. Yeah. Okay.
But when you're in a large space, like the Brooklyn Museum, it's never just one show.
No.
And I know it's not completely in like one exhibition designer or one curator's hands, what all is going on at once, but there is the notion, right, of the calendar and what shows are being paired with what shows.
Yes.
And I think that juxtaposition where you can elevate one artist by pairing them with another, that's the balance, right? Isn't that part of the curation on a macro scale?
It's very important when you're looking at the calendar to see what's going to be up together. I mean, you do have to be very considerate of that. And sometimes you have kind of a magic season that comes together where everything, you're like, oh my God, wow, and if, I'm sure subconsciously we're all working on that way. For example, this fall coming up is the Brooklyn Museum's 200th anniversary. So we've all been thinking about shows that celebrate the history of the museum, and where's the future going? Where are we today? It's a moment to kind of take stock of where we are, where we're going, an important milestone. So that's going to be very cohesive in terms of the season. Other times, you think about the fact that, if I have this show up that is going to draw a lot of people, or projecting it's going to draw a lot of people. If we had that up, so many more people would get to learn about that artist. Wouldn't that be great? Maybe we can put them in a gallery that people have to walk through before they get to the other show, or you do start thinking about strategies, to help people learn about new artists, new ideas. But you are, as you are here in the Pollock House, you do have to work with your architecture. Your architecture is going to not dictate, but it's going to guide you in certain directions because it may or may not work. One of the great things that happened to me recently was that we have on our third floor, there's a part of the building called the Beaux-Arts Court. And it's this beautiful room. McKim Mead and White had designed it in the late 19th century. And it was actually based on a 15th century building in Rome. It was the Santa Maria della Pace cloister. So if you stand in the middle of our Beaux-Arts Court, it looks exactly like you're in Rome. I mean, not exactly, but very close in that direction. And so that room I had been wanting to do an exhibition in since I started Brooklyn. And I saw photographs, that they had done exhibitions in there, like in the 40s and 50s and even up to the 60s. But because it was such a beautiful space, it was also one of the spaces everybody wanted to rent. Mm-hmm. They wanted to have their wedding there. They wanted to have a conference in that room. And so during COVID, Netflix got in touch with me and they said, we want to talk to you about doing a virtual fashion exhibition. And I said, well, okay. We're going to scan the dresses. We're going to do all this stuff. So we did a show. It was called The Queen and the Crown. You can still see it online. And we did 3D scans of all the dresses from The Crown and the Queen's Gambit, with Anya Taylor-Joy. And they built the Beaux-Arts Court, because I could never do a show there. So they built it in the computer, and then we put the dresses in it. You could virtually walk in on your phone or your laptop, hit the dress, and it would pop up and it would tell you about it. And I incorporated artwork from the collection in it. So simultaneously, for years, I had been talking to Dior about doing a big retrospective because the 75th anniversary of the New Look was coming up. And I was like, let's do that, So during the pandemic, all sorts of things stopped and closed. And the rentals for this Beaux-Arts Court space just disappeared, So, and then I had just done this virtual show in that room. One day I got an email from Dior, who we stayed in touch, but we hadn't quite figured out how we were going to work together. And they said, our schedule's changing. We bet your schedule's changing too. Maybe it's a good time for us to talk again. And I was going to have a meeting with the administration at the museum, and I said, we don't have any rentals for that space. I have this idea. What if we do the Dior show in this space? I did it virtually, but what if we do it live? And we did.
And that is such a beautiful space.
It's very beautiful, yeah.
Now, I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions, but final question before I do. Moving from your career as exhibition designer, you started as exhibition designer at Brooklyn Museum in '99, right?
Correct.
And then what?
Next week's 25 years.
Oh.
So.
When you became the senior curator of fashion and material culture, did that feel like a big shift? How did your career, your freedom change at that point? And then also, after that part, if you could tell us what you're working on at the moment.
Oh, okay. So what happened is that, it was this transition moment. Arnold Lehman had retired, and Pasternak was coming in as our new director. She had been working in public art for a long time. She initiated the artist who did the Twin Towers of Light. I mean, Anne did such amazing projects. And we were looking at shows, that were coming up. And the David Bowie exhibition had been in London. It had opened. And I went to see it in London, and we were all like, we're not sure, but I had been a big David Bowie fan since high school. I had this fabulous art teacher in high school named Michael Lacostick, and every week we used to exchange record albums back when it really was vinyl. We didn't have any CDs. And he would bring in a record and say, you should hear this. And I would bring him records and you should listen to this, And one week I brought him in all of my Talking Heads albums to listen to. And he said, I have something you have to listen to. So the Talking Heads had been working with a producer named Brian Eno. Well, the next week, Mr. Lacostick brought in all of David Bowie's albums, including, of course, the ones that he did with Brian Eno. And I hadn't ever really listened to Bowie. I mean, I was into pop and new wave and these different kinds of genres. And I started listening to them. And it was hard. Remember when Laurie Anderson said difficult listening? It was a little bit like that for me at the beginning, because it didn't all make sense, but I kept listening and, trying to understand what I was listening to. So because of that, I became this huge David Bowie fan and knew tons about David Bowie. So we were going to do the David Bowie show, and there was kind of a question, well, who's going to do David Bowie, And I knew I was going to design it. But one day Anne said, would you be interested in being the curator for the David Bowie show? And I said, absolutely. And so suddenly I got to be in the role of curator again. And what I did was I took the London show, because they were in London, it was very London focused, how they had curated it. But David Bowie had lived in New York for 20 years by that point. And so I worked with the archive. I took the London show apart and I added in 100 more pieces that were more about New York, and I put it back together again, and then I designed it. Okay. So I had this opportunity to kind of recurate it and then design the show, and it did really well. And after that, Anne said, would you be interested in going back to curating? And then we talked about what the title would be. Mm-hmm. So that's how it ended up being. I was kind of like, well, could I just be curator at large? I mean, did I have to really have a focused area? But of course she knew I loved fashion. Mm-hmm. So that's how I made that transition.
Okay.
So my next show opens November 15th. It's called Solid Gold, and it'll be for the museum's 200th anniversary. And what I did was, having worked there for such a long time, I've spent a long time looking at the collection. And if you've worked at a museum, you know that they have a program called TMS, which is the museum system. And so it's kind of a cataloging system, and you could go in and do searches for various materials and things. Yes. Yeah, so you're familiar. You're very familiar with that. So the museum has over 180, approximately 1,000 pieces in the collection, depending on how you count it, plus the library, which has 300,000 volumes. And I started doing searches, and there were 4,000 pieces in the collection that were either gold or had a gold aspect to them. And so last summer, I spent looking at almost all of them. And from that, I picked about 250 works that were gold or had a gold aspect to them. And that created kind of the skeleton for the show, which was in chronological order because we have everything from ancient Egypt till today. And then I infused it with fashion and jewelry. So it's a nice conversation that's happened between all these different periods of art and contemporary 20th, 21st century fashion.
And how does that feel? Kind of, you said that you were concerned when Anne first asked you, oh, it's so specific, but now this show, you are branching out into painting and other objects. Correct. How does that feel?
Well, what I did was I love to collaborate. So I actually asked all the curators who were specialized in all the different departments to actually help point me in the right direction of, what is your best gold Mesoamerican object? What is your best, Mediterranean coast object? What is the best Japanese screen that we have? I could have just gone in and picked things, right. But since I have so much knowledge, in the museum, I really wanted to collaborate. So I'm very thankful to all 16 curators that helped me on it. So I branched out, but maybe I did it cautiously or thoughtfully because I really wanted to bring their expertise into the project.
I would say thoughtfully. And just in my limited scope of things, back when I worked at the Brooklyn Museum in a very tiny role, your reputation was always as, very high level person who made everybody feel like they were part of it. Your curatorial tours were always so welcoming. And you treated every employee of every level with such respect. And you gave everybody time. So this sort of collaborative practice and reaching out to somebody who that's their area, no surprise at all, and very much in keeping with your sterling reputation. Thank you for that, Matthew. Also, during the Pierre Cardin exhibition, we all got watches.
Yeah. That's a good start.
That was wonderful.
Yeah.
But at this point in time, I would like to open it up to the audience for any questions that you might have for Matthew. Does anybody want? Russ?
Yeah, you had spoken a little bit about creating buzz and how important that can be to an exhibition. Have you ever found yourself being influenced on maybe a macro level about creating buzz and designing something? Or have you felt that it's just kind of been this byproduct of making something the best it could be?
Well, first of all, when I started out working with foam core models and things, one of the things that would happen is that people would say like, oh, take a Polaroid of it through the doorway so you could see what it looks like, and so that would be how you would kind of like people would talk about like, what's it look through the doorway, so that was a big point of conversation. Today, you're having a design meeting. Everyone's going, what's the 360? Where are the Instagram moments? This is how the conversation has changed. When I've gone in to make shows, I always wanted to make a great show. I wanted the art to look great as best it could look. I wanted it to be in a way that people could experience it. I talked sometimes about how you're choreographing a show, but you're putting casework or walls so that people walk around things. One of the things I noticed when I first went to Brooklyn was that they had some galleries that didn't have any walls or casework in the middle. And it was just like a long stretch of wall, which can be beautiful for painting, but a lot of people don't stop. They just start walking to that hall and they don't stop to look at things. They're kind of doing this. And so I sat in the gallery watching this activity and I just went like, we have to not create obstacles, but you have to create a reason for people to stop, and look at things, spend more time with it, And so I want, for objects that are three-dimensional, you want people to walk around them if they can. You know, like if this sculpture were here, we would walk around. We would have many experiences, different experiences than you do now. So I always felt we want the art to look the best. I do now, though, think about like what's my 360 and is every view in the room Instagrammable? And that can affect a little bit your choice of artwork, I will say, you know, because if you were taking a photograph of this wall, for example, those beautiful photographs on the wall aren't going to read in your Instagram post, but that sculpture will, and that's going to be the one that gets talked about the most, you know? So you have to be thoughtful about how you're positioning things. Like if you were going to do that again, maybe you put a smaller sculpture next to it so that when they take the Instagram picture,
wow.
you could see the photograph as well as you can the sculpture.
Making the photographer walk up closer by the
Correct.
sculpture. Oh, very
Correct.
interesting.
I think you have to think about that today. And that's so much of your buzz. You know, people communicate with each other so much on Instagram, different social platforms today. And if you don't have the buzz, you're not going to sell tickets or people aren't going to see your show as much. So that was a roundabout answer, but yeah, you're welcome.
Go ahead.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much.
Mhm.
This was so interesting. It was
Oh.
really inspiring to hear about all of the many things that you've done.
Oh, thank you.
I'm curious, are there, like sort of on the inverse, are there fashion brands that you look at today that are curating or integrating art in a really interesting way that you admire?
Oh, there have been a lot of collaborations between artists and fashion. I mean, one of the most well-known ones I think we often point to is Elsa Schiaparelli in the 1930s, her collaborations with Jean Cocteau and Dali. And those are kind of, you know, if you were thinking about doing a show about art and fashion, you would go to that immediately. I think today a lot of the fashion brands have looked at those collaborations as a little bit like a cachet, not to say they're not successful, you know, but I think, you know, when you think about Louis Vuitton collaborating with Yayoi Kusama, who's a hot artist, even though she's 98 now or something, I mean, she's still a hot artist, you know. People want that immediately. It's like they have to have that collector's item. And I think that too happened like when Vuitton again had collaborated with Steven Sprouse and he did that, you know, scribbling on the thing. But there have been so many brands now that have tried to do a collaboration to create a collectible item, you know, like during COVID, it was amazing how many people were doing collaborations. I mean, I remember walking by the Coach store and they had done something with Robert Indiana, and I was surprised. I was like, really? You know, you know. I mean, I enjoy it. You know, seeing, you know, and again, it gets the artist's name out to a broader public, which I don't disagree with. You know, I think it's great to get, you know, when we were hanging out in the Pollock painting studio before this, and it had that great Life magazine article.
Mm-hmm.
You know, at the time that article came out, that was like so like, oh my God, the painters covered in Life magazine. But Life magazine covered a lot more of art and life. You know, it's like when you think about like, I don't know if you have, it's called like Me TV or something, but they have reruns of old Johnny Carson on it from the 60s and 70s. You know, the artists used to be on Johnny Carson. I mean, there's like, you know.
Dali was on everything.
Dali was on everything. Charlotte Moorman, avant-garde cellist, she was on Johnny Carson. I mean, artists were kind of just more out it's a part of the world, you know. And today, it's a different thing. But I think these collaborations, artists aren't on talk shows very often today, right? They're not on Jimmy Kimmel or the other guy, but but these collaborations perhaps are stepping in and doing that work. So I like it. Yes. Hi.
I just want to carry on your question and shift it to another.
Mhm.
This is my collaboration with a fashion designer.
Mm.
It has been a great experience. Then she comes to my show and we have barely know each other.
Oh.
And she wants to just collaborate on one of my prints and to do a series of work.
Nice.
That's-
So you agree that it's
I
happening?
agree,
Yes.
But it's
Okay.
a different kind of expertise on different ends.
Mhm.
My question can turn to your early experience on kind of shifting a little experience, shifting your kind of focus of totally based on a well-established education and adapt into a newer area which you have fully kind of passionate, interested, but not that much kind of established education on that. And that is scary for me because I'm doing this kind of shifting right now, kind of exploring my art practice into performance a little bit, which has been trained, but not like fully educated in assistant based. And how did you kind of establish yourself, or I would say, get yourself into that area, especially when you're talking with some expertise that has years of experience with painting, and you're doing the painting. So how do you feel that, and how do you kind of?
Well, you know, I think you have to have a certain comfort level with risk.
Yeah.
You know, I think you do have to feel like you can take chances, and that if the chance doesn't work out, you're still okay. I mean, you have to have that with yourself. I mean, I can't tell you how many scary times I've had over the years, you know, where I wanted to, you know, I mean, today I know I'm going to collaborate with this curator because they know a lot about that. You have to not feel that you have to be an expert in everything also. You have to feel that there are people you can collaborate with and be open with, you know, about that. So I think you have to evaluate how much risk you can take, acknowledge that I maybe don't know everything I need to know, but you're going to learn from the process, and that you're comfortable reaching out to people when you need a thought partner. Thought partner, yeah.
Do you have a kind of a committee of thought partners?
Oh, you know, there are people whose opinions I respect, and if I am making a decision that I'm on the fence about, I'll like make an appointment to have a dinner or a phone call and talk through. And I have to tell you, like, my biggest thought partner was, and she's 92 now and she's not so together anymore, but my mom was one of my greatest thought partners, because she, you know, of course she was, you know, there for my whole upbringing and had a lot of, my mom had a lot of opinions, you know, so I would be like in second grade and my mom would say, Matthew, I think you need to go back upstairs and rethink that outfit. I mean, I was like in second grade. I mean, that was a lot, you know, when you're like this big, you know? So, I mean, and I remember I would go to my closet and just be like, well, why doesn't this work? And of course I'd have a chit chat with mom, like, that was upsetting, you know, or something. So, but, you know, even though I told you that story earlier about switching directions in college and I could hear the phone drop, My mom was always somebody that I could rely on to have. She had really, she had really great taste. And, you know, if I was on the fence about something, she would say, no, you shouldn't do that. You know, I mean, she would have a very clear opinion, you know, which was helpful. So, and so it could be your mom, but it could be a best friend, it could be a workmate. But you know, you do have to kind of search out those people whose opinions you agree with and respect. Yeah. So,
Mate,
thank you. Hi.
You touched upon collaboration a little bit, but I'd love for you to expand on what is it about the work environment at the Brooklyn Museum that is unique and has made you want to stay for close to 25 years?
Oh, thank you so much. Well, part of my liking to go from the Whitney to Brooklyn. So the Whitney Museum is 20th century American art, pretty much. I mean, there are those moments where they go like, "Oh, we're going to show Mexican artists. Oh, we're going to bring someone from Canada," you know. But it's mostly 20th century American, 50 states, sometimes Puerto Rico. You know, I mean, but. During those years that I was at the Whitney, you know, we had nice vacation time as a part of the job. And so I started every year taking 3 or 4 weeks vacation, like together. And what it allowed me to do was to travel. And in the late 80s, early 90s, I remember I just thought like, why am I looking at art in books? I should go see it in person. And so my travels started being, you know, going to see the great museums of the world, but then it became to see architecture. It became, you know, to go to Africa and see the performances live. And you start having a lot more life experience. So part of my draw going to Brooklyn was that it wasn't just 20th century American art. It was global, pan-historical, and really allowed me to also explore my interests in having kind of world travel. And over the years, it's just kind of grown there. So you know, I think Brooklyn takes some chances with our shows, and I feel like it does keep evolving. You know, it's not a stagnant place. Yeah.
Bill?
Oh, hi.
I was curious about your experience going each year on the site and going in to see the studio, and what do you think of the role of a historic site like this plays? And if you were to curate something here, how would you go about it?
Well, first of all, I was like going to like some church or something, walking into the painting studio. I mean, I couldn't walk on that floor. I mean, it was really just extraordinary to see that and to be up so close to it, you know. You know, I think if you're somebody that is interested in 20th century art and you come here, I mean, you know who Jackson Pollock is, and you're very curious to know about where he lived and what he was looking at and what the views were and what it feels like out here. And I think you're also kind of wondering like how he started making his signature style of painting. Normally, if I was going to start a project about a particular artist, I'd spend a long time reading. So I would probably, you know, I mean, of course, I've seen the films and, you know, even the Hollywood film about Jackson Pollock. But normally I go through a long research period when I'm working on a show. Even when I was doing the exhibition design, I would find out what it was about, and I would spend a lot of time reading about the artists. Like when we did Georgia O'Keeffe, Living Modern, I read a lot, a lot of, there's been a lot of books about Georgia O'Keeffe. But then what was kind of transformative was that I went to Abiquiu, her house in New Mexico, and I was allowed to actually go through her wardrobe. And so I went into all of the clothes that Georgia O'Keeffe had worn, that she had commissioned to be made. I was the one that like found her black suits and dated them, because one of the things people don't know is that if you get like a men's tailored suit, if you look on the inside pocket, it'll say when it was made. So I dated all of the black suits that we showed from Georgia O'Keeffe in the show. And it was, that was kind of a mind-blowing experience to kind of go through her personal effects. And then to compare it with her artwork and to like sit in her studio and see what she saw when she looked out the window, which was why it was so extraordinary when Matt was describing to me that Jackson had moved the painting studio so that you could see the lake, the pond. I mean, those are things that artists do, because they want to have that view. They want to see something in a particular way. So I would start there if I was going to do a project. I'd be reading a lot, and I would probably want to snoop through all of the drawers and things in the building and do it. But what a legacy here. I mean, oh my God, it's just extraordinary,
Anybody else? Question?
Yeah.
Oh, Dean?
Hi.
Thank you for that. It was really useful.
Oh, thank you.
Given your long, varied career in, I don't know whether you would agree, would it be a fair statement to say the sort of celebration of art? I wonder, given your beginnings in film, if there are any filmmakers or particular pieces in film that you might point to that you're particularly fond of, where you feel are set up, framed, shot particularly beautifully.
There are films that I've gone back. Oh, well, first of all, let me just say, when you're in film school and you're taking film classes, it's amazing how many times different classes will have the same film on the agenda for that season. So you end up seeing some films multiple times because that's what they want you to be thinking. I mean, how many more times can we see Citizen Kane? So, I mean, not that it's a bad film. But the kind of films at that point that I was attracted to were very experimental films like Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising. When I was in film school, you really couldn't see the Warhol films yet because he had put them under lock and key. But I was very much drawn to the experimental films. And I liked Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising because it had a pop music soundtrack. The same was true of some of Bruce Conner's films. They had pop music. So I love that, saturated color and juxtaposition of images with the soundtrack. And there were two pieces in the 80s that I watched probably 100 times each. Of course, the 80s was the time of the, video music clips. And there was also a program on PBS where they were doing, they were commissioning choreographers to make film videos. And there was a French choreographer named Christophe de Coufflet who did a video called Codex. Oh my God, I couldn't watch Codex enough time. And finally, I was in France once, in Lyon, and they have a dance festival there. And I saw Codex live, and it was extraordinary. So when I did the David Bowie show, I included a piece that Philippe had choreographed to the music of David Bowie. The other piece that was crazy influential for me was Jean-Paul Goude and Grace Jones' one-man show. If you ever have a chance to see that, it's 45 minutes, it's beyond. And it was around the time when Grace did her album Night Clubbing. And Jean-Paul Goude had been an art director at Esquire magazine during the 70s. And he did a lot of amazing kind of cut photography where he would, he would say he was extending the body. And then in 1989, he did the French Bicentennial Parade in France. It's like 3 hours long, but Jesse Norman's wearing a laya, singing the Marseillaise, going down the Champs-Élysées. I mean, it's extraordinary. They're not clips from feature films, but I've been very much inspired by those more experimental kind of films. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
In that answer, I think that you touched upon your love of music. We have a number of musicians in the audience tonight. And music in the shows I've seen of yours tends to play a big role. How do you view combining the visual with the sonic in your exhibitions? Is that very important to you?
It is, even from the beginning. I think I've said many times that if I don't have the right soundtrack, I can't design a show. I think it has to do because when I was little, I was always taking art lessons, but I was always taking piano lessons, and I would alternate. I'd practice my piano lesson, and then I would sit and draw, and I would go back and forth between the two. And I think that's kind of where art and music got connected in a very big way, because then later, when I was taking drawing classes, I would always have to have music going, or else I just couldn't draw. When I'm doing exhibition design, I need to find that right music to listen to that kind of speaks to me and has the right mood. It puts you in the right zone to do it. And kind of like if I can't find a piece of That's okay. If I can't find the right piece of music, you have kind of go-tos. And so if I'm having a dilemma that I can't find a new piece of music, I always end up listening to the Talking Heads' Remain in Light. I have, like those videos I told you I've seen 100 times, I've probably listened to that album 1,000 times. I mean, it's so complex and just, yes.
Is that music that you listen to put your shows together, or is that music that you're going to have on during your exhibitions?
So, music to work by. Yeah.
Because that's so important to me, too.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And it's funny because in the YouTube, Ed Harris, when he was making the movie out here, he said he couldn't find a character, he couldn't find a character, he couldn't find a character. And when the music guy, he's also on the same YouTube, would introduce the music that was from the soundtrack, he said, I got it right away.
Right.
I got it right away. I heard the music and I knew the rhythm.
Yes. No, I think it's so, and a lot of music, not all music has words, and so it's really kind of a fabric that's in the space that puts you there, When we were working on the Dior show, we were working with a sound artist in Montreal to make the central gallery for that room. And we went through a couple different versions of the music that was made for the show. And finally we hit on this one piece that we were all like, don't touch it, don't touch it. And it just, when people, I had so many people ask me if they could buy the music, but you can't, because it was just site-specific to the room. But it really can add so much to an exhibition.
Oh, yeah.
When I did Cardin, I knew that I had to have Jean-Michel Jarre in the room that I had this 28-foot light moving
Yeah.
overhead. But I knew I had to have that. Sometimes, I think specific music you want to have in the gallery. The show I'm working on now with Solid Gold has some challenges for me music-wise because I picked 2 videos that have soundtracks that are, one has Dvorak, which is just like, and another has a hip-hop soundtrack. And I'm like sweating bullets, like how I'm gonna marry this through the show.
Those two differences.
Yes, I think I'm going to have a lot of soundproofing between.
Yeah. Directional audio.
Yes, exactly.
Well, at this point, I will put some music back on.
Okay.
If anybody, if you want to hang out, please do hang around. Thank you all so much, and thank you, Matthew. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was nice. Excellent.